Oh yeah, I reckon so. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Got all the midterms graded now, so you should see your grade there for that. Also, for those of you that are at Southwest, or if you want to travel from Southside, you're welcome to as well. But we've got a innovative agriculture forum and skill swap next weekend, November 8th and 9th at Southwest Community College. And I've got some free tickets for that for students. So if you're interested in going, I'll put an announcement up and a link to it as well. Just let me know and I'll figure out how to get you the free tickets. I'll be there for the skill swap myself, doing a couple of workshops. So we can also count that as a field trip. I've finally got a couple more trips scheduled for us as well. One to a kind of a new small scale local dairy, which is kind of unheard of, be small scale this day and age with all of the dairy regulations. And they do stuff with plants and animals, so we can get both field trips in on that. That'll be next Friday on the 8th. Also, I've got one, it's a little ways for Southwest students to travel, but a local mushroom grower for this Friday. Let me know if you're interested in that. And for all of these trips, I'll be getting the bus here. I'll drive over to Southwest so we can kind of meet at a central point, and we'll travel from there. Try to arrange it to where the field trips are closer to you guys in Southwest as well. So anyway, that said, let's get back to chapter 10 on cultivated plants, their naming, classifying, origin. Let me share the screen with you here. All right. So we left off here on Monday talking about wheat and how it is the most widely cultivated plant in the world today in the Triticum genus. Also one of the, at least what is believed to be the first cultivated crop due to the mutation in shattering and then also the chromosome doubling from the combination of multiple species occurring. Allowing really with the chromosome doubling just more traits to be seen and more to be manipulated through breeding. So it kind of started there in the Near East and then moved around the world. The modern species that we look at are Triticum estivum and turgidum, and they add a group. And you'll notice that on some of our cultivated crops that where they have enough characteristics that differ, but are still interbreeding, that they often will add a group designation onto them as well as just the genus and species. So the durum for group, for instance, is used for particular types of wheat going into usually the processing for pasta. We also had a Turkey red wheat that was brought from Russia by immigrants coming to the U.S. And just the movement of that seed and that variety of plant actually established this hard red winter wheat industry. So the estivum mostly used for flour and making breads and pastas. The durum group mostly for pasta. We find that different species have different characteristics that lead to the different uses. That's something in your all's crop reports I want you to really look at. Whether you're looking at a particular cultivated variety or a species of crop, looking at how the different genetics lead to different uses of it. And we'll look at a few examples of that today to give you guys kind of a starting point there. So the wheat cultivars, that have been developed in more recent history, they're looking at trying to develop disease resistant. So the first big disease was stem rust disease. And a lot of our plant diseases tend to also evolve and adapt along with what we're doing to the crop. So a lot of the wheat cultivars need to constantly be developed and continually be bred in order to cope with that mutating pathogen for the stem rust as well. When we're talking about wheat, they are self-pollinated, so that allows farmers to actually be able to save their seeds for future planting. In terms of the sexual propagation of plants, it's not really as big of a deal whether you can save the seed or not, because typically we can save the seed of anything. But if it's a hybrid variety, the seed that you save is not going to be reliably similar to the parents. You have, when we were talking about Mendel and the genetics, that segregation process. So whenever you're saving the seed from hybrids, which could be anything that is cross-pollinating, whether it's cross-pollinated by wind or by insects, we have different genetics being brought in, which doesn't mean you can't save the seed from it. It just means that it's not going to breed true to type. So in the sexual propagation, one of the big things that we're looking at is genetic purity. In the case of most of the self-pollinated plants, it's a biological thing. For wheat, for instance, they have perfect flowers. So they have both the male and the female flowers that are self-fertile right there in that same inflorescence, that same flower cluster. So that makes the cross-pollination difficult for the plant itself, but also for breeders too. So it's kind of a happy accident, good luck that we actually had the original crosses and the development of the non-shattering types of wheat developed from whence agriculture was born. Let's look at another huge crop grown worldwide today, Zea maize, corn, which came from the New World. And we look at the center of diversity as being kind of Central America. And some people would say what is modern day Guatemala is where the center of origin probably is. But it's fascinating to look at corn, because by the time European settlers came to the New World, to especially North America, corn had already been spread from South America, Central America, all the way up into the far corners of North America. Even the Native Americans in Canada were growing corn at that time. So it's fascinating, because we think of it as being in origination more of a subtropical or tropical crop, but being moved around and adapting to these new climates, it's kind of changed its whole genome. Basically, it's the gene pool expanded, and as these plants adapted to the different microclimates and climates, it became a staple of agricultural production in North America. Maize is Zea mays. The cultivated variety is the only known domesticated plant from corn, from that genus and species. There is a wild form, actually a couple of wild forms here. In the book they say that there is not one, but teosinte, which is a native crop found in Mexico, is very close relative. It's in the Zea genus. And actually Mexican farmers will allow the teosinte to grow outside of their fields, because they believe that it actually imparts some genes for hardiness into the corn. There's also an eastern gamma grass too that is believed to have contributed some of the genes to it, and that's kind of more in our region. Does it actually, the wild plant actually grow? And it's not very commonly found in the wild, but they believe that it also contributed some genetics to Zea mays as well. It's interesting because the economic life of the ancient American civilizations, as well as just their culture, depend on corn. We used to visit Native Americans in the Hopi in Arizona, and they basically, all of their ceremonies and their religion is really based on the corn plant. So even though it's this kind of unforgiving climate, very difficult place to grow crops, you know, they use it as their staple food, but also, you know, in marriage ceremonies, for instance. And so corn traveled from there, from the New World, is now being grown worldwide. It does mutate fairly easily, and that's partially due to the fact that it's wind pollinated and crosses easily. So it's an extremely variable species, and we can see that in the diversity of grain colors, the colors of the corn themselves, the kernels, to the size and the shape of the grains and the ears, and their uses too. So here's some of the hypotheses, you know, explaining the origin of corn as a crop. First, it developed from kind of a naked pod type in like the teosinte. And then under gradual selection, under the influence and the harvesting and regrowing by humans, it developed into these independent lines that come from these common ancestors, whether it's teosinte or tripascum, which is the eastern gamma grass. So the three-part theory that they have is that originally the cultivated corn originated from this pod corn, and then probably crossed at some point with teosinte as it moved kind of more into Mexico. And then the modern corn cultivars are the product of this genetic admixture of teosinte, the eastern gamma grass, and in many cases probably both contributing some of those genes to the pool that were then cultivated to develop all the new types of corn. So hybrid corn is, you know, basically almost all of the corn produced today is hybridized. At least, you know, if we look at it on a acreage basis, there's still tons of varieties out there, you know, that are open pollinated and you can easily save seed from. But the development of the hybrid corn is actually one of these huge achievements of modern agriculture. And that first started occurring in the 30s, actually late 20s in France and 30s in the US. If we look at the history there, in 1935, only about 1% of the corn planted in the US was hybrid. But 35 years later, by 1970, almost all the corn produced was hybrid. And one of the things with the hybridization and these hybrid crops is that actually led to a seed industry. Before that, you know, if farmers could just save their own seeds and reliably get similar products, then the farmers would just save their own seeds. When we have hybridization and you're able to control the two lines that lead to the hybrids, then you control the genetics, and therefore you're in a way making it to where people have to come back and buy it from you every year. So the first big step was the development of the hybrid cultivars, then the development of, you know, synthetic and use of synthetic fertilizers, in some places using irrigation, and then using mechanization to be able to harvest the corn, cultivate it as well. It dramatically improved cultivation, and now today corn is one of the world's chief food crops, which is also kind of interesting because corn is relatively indigestible in its pure form. We have to grind it down into cornmeal or make grits out of it, or soak it in water and lye to turn it into hominy in order to make it more digestible. And a lot of the Native American groups that were growing corn originally had kind of already figured this out. So they, use these different ways to make corn more digestible. The Hopi, for instance, they would actually, rather than using lye, they would burn the cobs of the corn and use the ash from that as a way to, start to break down that hard seed coat and make it more digestible. Now we have all kinds of different types of specialty corns that are, bred for particular purposes, whether it's sweet corn that is super sugary and great to eat raw or cooked on the cob, or we have some that are, more high in oils, some that are nutritionally enhanced, some that are more developed for starch, and some that are more developed for sugar, for high fructose corn syrup. And also today, even some that is developed for ethanol production. The major use of corn, though, in the U.S. and many parts of the world is for feed, though. And we usually use it as more of a finisher to add fat content to the marbling of beef, for instance, although we feed it to a lot of different animals. So here's a kind of more of a primitive type of corn on the left that, they're still growing in the Andes Mountains. And on the right, we have a modern hybrid, kind of more of a feed corn. The interesting thing is, though, is that the primitive types still, contain valuable traits. And in this case, the one on the left here, they're saying has multiple alurone layers in the grain, which makes it, better to use for germplasm, for stock to breed for modern dent corns that are used for feed. And I think this is just one example of many that shows why we need to maintain the germplasm of what some people would say are, less worthy crops. Even though I think the people growing it in the Andes in South America would say these are actually very useful. I recently read an article, and I'll share it with you guys. Take it with a grain of salt, but there's a grower in North Carolina who was down in the Andes and found this giant corn that grew, even in the Andes at higher elevations, cooler temperatures, and rockier soils. It was found growing, up to like 20 feet tall. So did a little bit of research on that, and they found that it has some sort of endophytic nitrogen production. So it's producing its own form of nitrogen. The farmers there in the Andes are not even really fertilizing it. It's fertilizing itself through this kind of fungal or bacterial relationship, which is still not completely understood. But again, it shows the importance of some of these traits that some of these varieties have. If we could find endophytic nitrogen producing crops, then that lessens the need for fertilizers, which nitrogen being a very mobile element often pollutes waterways. We say that actually the main pollutant of water is sediment, but that's followed closely by nitrogen runoff, which causes algal blooms and has devastating effects to freshwater ecosystems. Another very important grain crop is rice, Oryza sativa. And that sativa species basically just means common. And it is a basic food, a staple for more than half of the world's population, due to the fact that it is a staple in Asia, where we have more than half of the world's population. And we believe that it is one of the oldest cultivated crops. The modern varieties even appearing about 5,000 years ago or even earlier in some cases. There are about 25 species of oryza out there. Oryza perennis, the perennial version of rice, is likely to be the one that the modern cultivated rice was developed from. And as with all of the crops, as they were cultivated, there were more mutations, more hybridization that occurred, which led to the improved forms and new novel characteristics that could be bred. Rice was first cultivated in America around 1685. And there's still modern varieties that were grown in like South Carolina, for instance, the golden rice. And it, you know, although it wasn't as important as a staple crop in the U.S., it did develop experiment stations through the USDA in the early 1900s that resulted in many superior cultivars being introduced, and also more hybrid varieties of rice, which now are very common in Asia. We also have developed a genetically engineered version of rice that produces beta carotene and has vitamin K in it, which increases the nutritional value. And we've sent that to you know, countries where there are, you know, there's a widespread famine. And for instance, in parts of Africa, there were a lot of children were going blind because of a lack of vitamin K and beta carotene in their diet. Introducing this rice to them, you know, now gives them those, you know, necessary nutrients and is preventing that blindness in children in third world countries. Soy, a legume in the legume family, glycine max, is another one of our big commodified crops in the U.S. and is very important around the world. And started as, I mean, still being an important crop, but in the 20s, looking at about 5 million bushels being harvested to about 3 billion bushels in 2008. And again, that's due to development of more productive and disease-resistant cultivars of soy, as well as development in technology, allowing for the mechanization, easy harvesting, easy cultivation of the crop as well. We also brought many to the U.S. from the Orient, but from the USDA, you know, from Asia, where again soy had been a staple crop for, you know, many years. And then here we hybridized and developed superior cultivars. In some cases, we shipped them back to Asia, getting higher yields, stronger plants that have reduced shattering and higher disease resistance, more protein in the bean itself. They found that soy was particularly well adapted to the Midwest and Southeastern states. So together, you know, that accounts for about 40% of the world's soybeans. And soy is often used as feed as well, but it's a major export to Asia. And both corn and soy are important. And we mentioned this earlier, talking about kind of the agroecological, you know, implications of growing these crops. They're often rotated because soy, being a legume, is a nitrogen fixer. So it's putting some nitrogen back into the soil, which the corn will readily use. So crop rotation is very important with the grains and legumes, as well as together being a very important part of the human diet. The sugar beet, Beta vulgaris, is basically just like your regular garden beet that we find in all kinds of different colors, in some cases different shapes and sizes. grown for their leafy tops as well as the sweet roots. Sugar beet was developed entirely through plant breeding, and it is also now a major commodified food crop. Although it was not really grown in a primitive form in ancient times. The actual sugar beet that we have today was developed fairly recently, about 250 years ago in Europe. And the whole idea there was to compete with sugar cane. Sugar cane is, grown in, tropical parts. There's some production in the U.S., but it's, it requires a lot of moisture, high temperatures, whereas the beet is more of a temperate crop. So we could grow beets, sugar beets in different areas and process them for sugar. And today, the vast majority of sugar in the United States comes from beets and not from sugar cane. And, on a chemical level, they contain the same kind of sugar. The breeding and selection increased that sugar content from kind of more of the primitive forms of the beet that had about 2% to today, having up to and slightly above 20% sugar content, which is, unheard of. And although they had been growing in North America by the end of, the 19th century, late 1800s, they have become more and more of an important crop today as we, move away from sugarcane and shift to sugar beets. Even though it was developed a long time ago, it's not until, really the past few decades that sugar beets have become a major commodified and subsidized crop. The potato, Solanum tuberosum, which tuberosum just referring to the tubers of the crop itself, is also a new world crop and is one of the big four crops that are important for feeding the world's population. Potato is actually the highest yielding crop per pound for what you plant versus what you get out of it. It yields better than any other crop. There are many different wild species widespread in South America in the foothills of the Andes, and especially in Peru. And they were likely cultivated much more than 4,000 years ago. They were a staple of their diet. If you look at the center of diversity there are thousands of varieties of potato, whereas around the world there are many less. If you guys grow potatoes, you often we're producing them asexually. We're cloning them through dividing that tuber into the sections with eyes, and in doing so, we're not changing the genetics, which has all kinds of different implications, but one of them is just the lack of diversity. Often we're going to purchase potatoes from, like at your southern states, your local farm bureau, some sort of store that carries seed potatoes. Usually they're only going to have 3 or 4 varieties, which is kind of funny because you think about how, in South America, there are, thousands of varieties. Spanish explorers were the first to bring the potato back to Europe, where today about 90% of the world's potatoes are grown. And as I mentioned, per pound planted, it is the highest yielding crop found on planet Earth. So how did it happen? We believe that the South American natives likely selected superior plant types just from natural crosses occurring. They actually were saving the seed, but then, we clone it through that tuber division to get the superior planting stock. Many of these that were propagated through the vegetative methods became the commercially successful cultivars that we have today. Some of these, however, because they are a clone and they lack that genetic diversity, they will start to kind of digress, kind of degenerate after many generations and start to yield only weak, unproductive plants. They also become infected with viruses that can be passed along generation to generation, other diseases. So we get that through the cloning, but every once in a while we have to propagate them by seed to get new genetics in there so that they're not easily wiped out by one disease, such as what happened with the potato blight and famine in Ireland. So in modern cultivation for commercial growing, we actually have producers that grow what we call the seed potatoes, and we have certified producers that are very strictly inspected to, be sending out disease-free tubers. The tomato, which the scientific name they've kind of changed from Lycopersicon esculentum to Solanum Lycopersicon. They're synonymous though. I usually use the Solanum genus because we can actually graft tomatoes onto potatoes. You guys might have seen that in some of the plant catalogs out there. The Tom-tato, they call them, or ketchup and fries, where you get both your tomatoes and your potatoes from one plant. I think it's more of a novelty, but it can be done. If you have a small area, that might be worth looking at doing that. So the cultivated tomato originated also from the New World, from wild forms, which are growing as perennials in South America and the foothills of the Andes. Explorers introduced the tomato back to Europe in the mid kind of 16th century, and then it was brought back west to North America around 1710. And initially, especially in Europe, most people consider the tomato poisonous. And that Solanaceae family, the family that tomatoes and potatoes are in, is full of a lot of different very poisonous plants, like deadly nightshade, for instance. And because of that, it was mostly just grown as a botanical curiosity. Later on, someone had the idea. We're growing it for potentially several hundred years without eating it. And indeed, the leaves are poisonous to humans. Same with potatoes. But the fruit, of course, is not, as we all know. And somebody decided to try it out. They loved the flavor, and it began to be accepted as a food in Europe, and then later on in the U.S. as a crop, kind of in the early 19th century. And then it developed into being a very important crop. It's not subsidized, not a commodified crop, but still important just in terms of its market share. In the early 1900s, the USDA in different states developed the experiment stations again to start breeding new cultivars with specific characteristics, especially disease resistance. Some that were developed for machine harvesting, some that were developed to be more determinate instead of indeterminate, more bush-like plants instead of vine-like plants. So we get those that have firm flesh that all ripen at one time, so we could easily bring in a machine to harvest them all. We've also developed hybrid varieties of tomatoes, like the Better Boy, right? That are marketed both as seeds and in some cases as bedding plants as well. They're more vigorous because of that hybridization, which makes them very highly productive. Moving to the woody plant world. Actually, let me just mention one more thing about tomatoes. It's grown incredibly, there's like a cult following of tomatoes. And if you look at Seed Savers Exchange, for instance, they have a yearbook where every year that you can offer and trade varieties with growers from around the world. About 3/4 of that catalog is tomato varieties today. All right, moving to the woody plant world, apples, Malus domestica, have become a very important plant. I try to eat an apple every day. And the kind of edible apples that we have today in the U.S. Actually were not really available early on. It started as a cider industry, for hard cider for alcohol consumption. And you probably heard the story of Johnny Appleseed at some point. It's actually based on a true story. This guy, John Chapman, was out there, and he took the seeds that were left outside of these cideries, and he began taking each seed and take a little rafting trip down the Ohio River, and he would plant them, kind of in a guerrilla gardening type fashion, planting these seeds on the banks of the Ohio River to develop trees, really initially for the production of cider. It's believed, though, that the wild apples in the U.S., there are Malus species that are found in the United States to this day, crab apples. It's believed that they crossed with some of these apples and then gave rise to a more edible apple. So the seeds, have different genetic material. They are cross-pollinating, and they're pollinated by bees. So bees can travel up to several miles. So they're likely to, not be pure if you're planting them from seed. There are some varieties of apples that do self-pollinate. You can save seed from and grow a tree from seed and have it be, similar to the parents. But most of our commercial apple production is done through the asexual propagation technique of grafting. So we looked at these superior, seedling trees, or even the sports that just mutated on one branch and then developed hundreds of cultivars from those and started grafting them onto, different rootstocks. Today we do it a lot on dwarf or semi-dwarf rootstocks, where the rootstock actually controls the size of the plant and some disease resistance too. But the scion, that top part, gives you the edible apples. So it developed into hundreds of varieties, and especially in Appalachia, we see these varieties still being grown, but they fell out of favor for the more modern varieties like Red Delicious, for instance. So, when these more modern varieties began to be developed, the numbers of varieties out there started to dwindle. And by the 80s, we found that only 15 cultivars of apples accounted for over 90% of the apples produced in the U.S. And basically all of those major apple cultivars began as either a sport or a chance seedling many years ago, and then was grafted from there. So there's a little story there about the Macintosh apple, founded by John McIntosh in 1796, or the Delicious that started, Red Delicious or Golden Delicious, started as a chance seedling near Peru, Iowa. And it's Peru in the U.S., not South America. But it's still important, I think, to plant seeds and to see, what characteristics might, pop up. We actually used to go to an old apple orchard that they believe was planted in the mid 1800s on a mountain outside of Blacksburg near Virginia Tech, and it's just this mountainside is just covered in this apple orchard. But not all of the trees are 150 years old. Many of them are younger, so they probably crossed with each other, developed fruit. That fruit fell, it came up on its own in the wild. And I saw some, apple varieties up there that I'd never seen before, and probably are unique. So we've been trying to actually get some of those and take the scion wood and then graft them onto rootstocks here on our campus. Saw one that was like almost purple in color, one that had like a candy cane like striping in the flesh, another one that tasted like cotton candy. So the gene pool is wide, even though today we're only growing, you know, a handful of varieties. I mean, you go in the grocery store, you know, what do you find? Like maybe 10 varieties tops of apples, when actually there's well over 100 out there. The pear is a kind of a similar story there, Pyrus communis. A different genus, but they're in the same family, the rose family. And same deal, the cultivars originated as chance seedlings, especially in varieties such as the Bartlett, which originated in England as a chance seedling in late 1700s, and then was grafted and became, you know, widespread. There actually are no pear cultivars that came from controlled breeding programs in the U.S. They're almost all by chance, by sports, or by chance seedlings. We've actually also, on the pear note, been experimenting. We have a lot of ornamental pears out there that are grown for the tree, not for the fruit, often as street trees. And the center of origin and center of diversity for both apples and pears is in you know, Eastern Asia. You know, we think of like modern day Kazakhstan as the center of diversity for apples, and in China for pears. So we've taken those varieties that are for ornamental value, we brought them over here, and now they've gone wild. They've kind of gone rogue, escaped from cultivation, and in some cases become weeds. So we have all these calorie pears, which are interspecific hybrids. You can see because they have different characteristics than like the Bradford pear that is commonly planted. We found, though, that you can actually graft some varieties of apples onto these pears. And one of them we did last year had about 2 feet of growth on it just in 1 year. So we're getting that vigor from the rootstock, but getting the fruit from the scion. Peaches and nectarines are both the same species, Prunus persica, and they are the products of both public and private plant breeding programs, the varieties that we have today. Not as much diversity there as there are in apples or pears, but some diversity. The strawberry is a North American crop. It's a, you know, one of these perennial crops. And when we see this in the scientific name, Fragaria X and Ananassa, that X just means that it's a hybrid, it's a cross. So today's strawberry actually originated in France as a hybrid between 2 American Fragaria species. Strawberries actually originated in North America. Their center of diversity is here. We have Fragaria virginiana is the wild strawberry that you see growing sometimes in fields, especially at higher elevations. Nice temperate perennial crop, even though it's an herbaceous crop. Number of these cultivar selections were made and then maintained vegetatively by the runners in the early days growing strawberries. So very easy to grow more strawberry plants from runners. Basically let those runners develop, and then you can just stick that crown of the newly developed runner in some soil and grow a new plant that is a clone of it. But again, whenever we have cloning, we have the issue of the genetics are all the same, so they become susceptible to things like viruses, other diseases like wilt. Many new cultivars since World War II have replaced those older ones, often from USDA and state breeding programs. To develop larger fruit, higher yielding crops of strawberries, being able to grow in specific climates, microclimates. Also, the adaptability of that fruit to be used for freezing, which is actually a pretty important part of the market for strawberries today, as well as more resistant to rot, so we can ship them fresh. A lot of our modern genetics, we look at developing it more for shipping so that we can move them from the areas that they are best produced and then ship them around the country. Let's talk a little bit about evolution here. And the theory of evolution, of course, started from Charles Darwin with his scientific explanations. In his time, they knew nothing about heredity. So Darwin actually, somewhat, built upon the work of Mendel, who demonstrated the genetic mode of plant inheritance, and therefore is the founder, in some ways, of modern science of genetics. The combination of their theories is generally what we accept as the proper explanation of evolution. And so what we're doing as crop breeders is we're looking at these patterns and trying to kind of emulate them in a much smaller amount of time to utilize the gene pools and get the better traits that we need for agriculture. So modern hybridization is what directs this accelerated evolution. And a lot of different breeding programs have been developed just to do that, for food, but also for ornamental crops as well. And most of these new lines are superior in vigor and insect and disease resistance, which makes them more economically viable. We also have some that are being bred more for flavor, appearance, and productivity. And also, in some cases, we're even breeding them for nutrition now as well. We're constantly having to continually breed and develop new varieties to get resistance as the insects and disease are also evolving. So it's kind of matched in a way. They evolve to the different treatments that we use. For instance, the use of pesticides. We have some weeds now that are becoming herbicide resistant. So we're basically looking at improving these plant forms by inducing mutations, whether that's through hybridization, naturally or unnaturally, or actually by inducing chemical treatments from some natural chemicals or from radiation from gamma rays or X-rays, which again increases chromosome number and provides just more traits that are able to be used. In some cases, we're also able to, in controlled environments, make intergeneric crosses. So before, it was thought that we just are looking at plant species as being able to cross together, create a product that, as long as it can pass those genes along, then it's of the same species and reliably look like the parents. But with some modern techniques, we've been able to hybridize, and make new genera of plants. So triticale, for instance, is a hybrid between wheat and rye from triticum and seedcale, crossing those two grains to make it an entirely new grain genus. We've been talking a lot about germplasm, and basically what germplasm is just the reproductive cells, the units of heredity. It can really be anything, depending on how we're looking at it, just so long as it contains the chromosomes and the genes. So plant explorers are out there looking at the germplasm of at the centers of origin and diversity, and looking for useful genes such as hardiness, drought tolerance, and breeding with those, using those as stock to get those traits into our modern crops. So how do we develop that? First, the collecting trips were unsuccessful because we're traveling by ship. It's really difficult to keep those plants alive, making these long cases. So this guy, Nathaniel Ward, developed the Wardian case, to enclose a box with soil as well to keep plants alive on these trips and move them around the world, which in many cases is actually developing new gene pools for crops. Today we're looking at trading genetic resources as a very important part of agricultural trade. $500 to $800 billion, we look at that in terms of agriculture. However, there's consequences to moving those plants around the world. Generally, we can incidentally introduce devastating insect populations or disease pests where they were never found before, like the chestnut blight. The Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the UN has developed this worldwide effort to try to basically create accessions. An accession is just the saving event of a crop's or in any plant's germplasm, whether that is just a cutting or a seed. Those are accessions, and then we store them often in seed banks. It's believed that today as many as 1 in 10 plant species are now extinct or endangered. However, some of these we are saving and storing for future use in protected locations and then later on disseminating. Last thing I just wanted to mention here, I know we're over time, but when we were hunters and gatherers, we were fed by a wide variety of plants and animals. And today, we're largely fed by about 20 main crops. And I think this just outlines the importance of still breeding and still developing new crops, maybe even from some wild plants that just haven't been bred for food crops before. Because if we are relying on just a few crops, then we could have catastrophic famine if they become susceptible to disease outbreaks or changes in the climate. All right, well, you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns there about naming plants, classifying them, and categorizing them, or anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah, shoot, Taylor.
When is our final exam?
Our final exam will be during exam week, and it'll be the same. It'll be done through Canvas. So you don't have to necessarily have the seated version of it.
Which, for all of our classes, they sent out the exam schedule the other day, Taylor. I'll start, once I look at it, I'll let people know when all those times are, like for my classes and anything else.
Okay, because my mom's been getting after me this week to figure it out because I'm getting my wisdom teeth cut out once school's done. So she wants to schedule it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
I think we can finagle that too.
I'm just gonna look at it, figure it out, but okay.
We'll give you a solid answer there on Monday.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Well, Hunter is there.
Hunter is here.
Okay, cool. I'll be calling back in a few minutes.
All right, y'all have a good one.
Bye.